Good afternoon and welcome to this joint event between the International Broadcasting Trust and the Media Reform Coalition. I'm Mark Galloway, I'm the director of IBT. In a moment I'll be handing over to Natalie Fenton, who'll be chairing today's discussion. At IBT, we work with the media to ensure that UK audiences are engaged with global issues. And the last week has shown us how important the media is. The story that's dominated is, of course, India. And one of the things we've learned is how important the media is for informing us about what's going on in the world. And television is particularly important. In the UK, and this is true of many other countries, television news is the main source of information for people about what's going on in the world. So one of the things we want to talk about today is how good a job is television doing and how could it do better? We have some excellent panelists, but I do want to encourage you, the audience, to put your questions in the chat room wherever you are, because we want this session to be as interactive as possible. And from IBT's point of view, the more we hear from the audience, the better. But now I'll hand over to Natalie Fenton, who's Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths College in London, and she'll be your host for this discussion.
Sorry, I made the cardinal sin already of keeping my mic muted. A very warm welcome to everybody to this session. I'm delighted to have you joining us for what I think is going to be a very important discussion. As Mark said, I'm Natalie Fenton, and I'm also chair of the Media Reform Coalition as well as Professor of Media Communications at Goldsmiths. For a brief introduction, I want to give you some of the issues and the reasons why we felt it was important to have this panel. Over a year into living with COVID-19 and no real ending in sight, we thought it was time to take stock of how well our media has served us. While news consumption initially skyrocketed and TV news bulletins in particular saw record numbers of live viewers, since then we've seen these numbers level out a bit and trust in media fall yet further. The annual Edelman Trust Survey found that 31% of the UK population trust the media, and that's 5% less than in 2020. Most people say they trust information sources that are closer to them. And in fact, most people trust the NHS as the best information source. So what does that mean then for international coverage of the pandemic? Have UK audiences been adequately equipped to understand the pandemic's global character? With a full domestic news agenda and travel restrictions on foreign correspondents, international stories can often get pushed to the margins. But as a deadly virus shows just how connected we are to the world, do UK audiences need to know more about the devastating impact of COVID in South America, the effectiveness of public health responses across East Asia, the pandemic's disparate impacts on diverse communities, or the struggles to supply vaccines to countries that can't afford them? As you've heard, this is a jointly organised event between the International Broadcasting Trust and the Media Reform Coalition. So we're going to be looking at what the pandemic can teach us about the place of international coverage within UK media, particularly those parts of the media that claim to act in the public interest. How successful are our national public broadcasters like the BBC and Channel 4 at giving audiences a truly international perspective? How do independent media with a global focus prioritise stories when their scope is the entire world? And what kind of media do we need for a world where pandemics may well become the norm? This event is part of the Media Reform Coalition's campaign called the BBC and Beyond, Reimagining Public Media. This aims to defend and re-envision public media in the digital age. And by public media, we mean media institutions that are fully independent, accountable, democratic and accessible to all. And that includes the very best of public service broadcasting, with a focus on the BBC and Channel 4, as they're owned by the public, as well as media cooperatives and democratically run community media. This discussion will feed into a manifesto for a people's media that we'll be writing later this year. And we've asked each of the speakers to suggest one thing they would put in a manifesto to change international news coverage in the UK for the better. If you in the audience have ideas, please do put them in the chat on whatever platform you're on. And you can also contribute to the manifesto on the BBC and Beyond website, and we'll put up a slide at the end of this panel that will direct you to that page. We've got an astonishing panel of speakers to talk through these issues for you. And I'm briefly going to introduce each of them before they do an opening presentation on these concerns. Our first speaker is Liliane Landor. Liliane is Head of Foreign News at Channel 4. Before that, she was Controller for Languages at BBC World Service News. She's Arab-British, Cuban mother, born in Lebanon, and speaks 5 languages. Liliane, thank you so much for joining us. Our second speaker will be Vanessa Baird. Vanessa is co-editor of the new Internationalist magazine, which is a flat structure cooperative owned by its readers and regulated by Impress. Vanessa's recently written about the need for an internationalist response to the pandemic for global vaccine equality and democracy. We're hoping that we will have a further speaker called Indi Samarajiva, who is a writer living in Colombo, Sri Lanka. But, oh, you're here, Indi. Hooray. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted you made it. We were worried you weren't going to get here.
Sorry about that. It took a while from Sri Lanka to take a flight.
Of course. Thank you very much for being here. Indi recently wrote a blog with the title "Vaccine Racism Has Made COVID Worse Than Ever." I quote, "India is completely buckling. The continent of Africa is barely vaccinated and folding fast. And as rich Western nations post their vaccination selfies, we're going down, and it's their fault. Their vaccine racism is getting us killed." We'll move on from Indi to Camilla Knox-Peebles, who is CEO of AMREF Health Africa UK, with 25 years of experience in the humanitarian and international development sector, and has lived and worked all over the world. Most recently, she was Deputy Humanitarian Director at Oxfam International, where she oversaw Oxfam's global work on public health, water and sanitation, capacity development of local partners, and disaster risk reduction. And finally, we will hear from Romilly Greenhill, who is WAN's UK Director. She's had roles at the New Economics Foundation and ActionAid, and was a policy expert for the 2005 Make Poverty History campaign. She then moved on to lead the Department for International Development's work on aid transparency, and spent 6 years as a senior research fellow and team leader at the Overseas Development Institute, leading their work on development finance. Each panelist has been asked to speak on the topic of the panel for 5 minutes, and I may ask a brief follow-up question, but then we'll open it up for discussion and debate. And as Mark said at the opening, we really want this to be as discursive as possible. So panelists, please do think of questions you can ask each other or responses to each other's comments. So without further ado, Liliane, I'm going to hand straight over. Thank you very much.
Hi. I hope you can hear me clearly. Many thanks for inviting me. I will be giving you a few thoughts, both personal and professional. So from my own trajectory through the COVID and Channel 4 News, and I'm sure everyone agrees that it's been a very hard year. It's been very bumpy, and personally, the only way I got through it, personally and professionally, was simply to forge ahead without looking right and without looking left. For months in the newsroom, our main concern was how to get on air and stay on air, how to get editors, producers, technicians, graphics people, i.e. the essential staff in the newsroom, how to rethink editorial meetings, how to cut a film in an edit suite with a plexiglass between you and the editor, how to keep informing, how to keep reporting, analyzing with a handful of journalists in the newsroom, socially distancing, all masked up, and the rest working from home, and still continue to produce outstanding reports and agenda-setting journalism and the beautifully crafted films that Channel 4 News does, how to make sure you do not drop your standards, how to report on an illness, on death, on grief, when it affected each and every one of us here and everywhere else. And in my case, how to cover the world when the world becomes completely inaccessible, how to cover the world and how to do it justice. So for those of you who do not know it, Channel 4 News is very small. It's a public service broadcaster. It's got very few resources by comparison with Sky or the BBC or ITV. A handful, literally, of foreign correspondents and 1.5 bureaus, a proper bureau in DC and a very small one in Bangkok. And a formidable reputation for its international news coverage. So we do not have correspondents dotted across the globe like other broadcasters. We do not have the resources. And when the borders closed and quarantines were imposed, with a small outfit such as ours, when it became absolutely impossible to travel, we had to think very fast, think on our feet and think laterally. And the solution was staring us in the face. It was working with and through crews, reporters, producers from the countries that we're reporting on. Channel 4 News has a very specific style and a high bar, all broadcasters do. So it was far easier said than done, and it required a number of things. It required first and foremost that we made sure that our responsibilities to these reporters and camera people and producers were taken very seriously. So risk assessments would have to be done from London, ensuring protective gear, masks, etc. were available, and if not, see how we can send them. And of course, making sure that people were paid proper fees. Then we would guide our reporters or camera people from here. We discuss sequences, how to film, what kind of elements, how to cut a film if we could not cut it from here. And then our foreign correspondent or a correspondent from London, mostly from home, would work directly with the filmmaker to script and track. And therefore it required an enormous amount of work, training, guidance, and patience. Mark originally, when he sent me an email asking me to be here, asked for specifics and specific examples. And I would very happily talk about Italy when we were first on the scene in Bergamo with an Italian woman independent filmmaker, or Lebanon, again, an independent woman filmmaker. In France, we had a producer. In India, we had eventually a reporter and crews. In Brazil, we worked through freelance crews. In Beijing, freelancers. In Liberia and Uganda, similarly. In Latin America, we had our own person, etc. So it was about making it work, and to some extent, although it's never perfect, we did make it work. But it is important for me to say that this was a crisis that we were completely unprepared for. Of course, we had and have and will never have monopoly on storytelling. There is a proliferation of pipelines of information, and ours is one of them. But for us, it was about what stories to tell, whose stories to tell, how you tell them, through what means, and how you engage your audience in the process. And the biggest story was and is still a global story. It's the world was reeling from one single story, so much so that the separation in newsrooms of foreign news v. home news was completely blurred. And pictures of bodies from New York City car parks piling up were not that different from what we are seeing in Delhi now, or what we saw in Brazil, or what we saw in Italy. But we did need eyes in China and Italy, ears in Iran and Brazil and Liberia. And we needed to know, we needed to learn from the Swedes or not, the Israelis or not, about these vaccines, how these countries were doing, what was happening there could happen now, and this is still the case. So I would say that we shared a great deal of information and reporting. We collaborated with journalists internationally on how to keep safe. We forged in the process fantastically important partnerships and kept telling stories and giving them context and linking them up. Lastly, one thing that I need to say, and there is that in some parts of the world, in fact, in many parts of the world, whether we're talking Brazil, India, Thailand, Israel, governments have used COVID and are still using COVID, CG India, as an excuse to crack down on journalists and on press freedom. And journalism has been very seriously impeded. New laws have been set, emergency decrees have been invoked, sites are being blocked, people are being taken off social media. The practice continues, and in my opinion, it's never been more important and more dangerous than being a journalist than it is today.
Thank you very much, Liliane. I recognise very many of those issues, and I want to bring the panel back to talk about the oppression of journalists and media freedom later on. I think the point you made about who says what to whom is absolutely vital when we're talking about international news coverage, and particularly during a pandemic. And one quick follow-up question. You said you were totally unprepared. Everybody was, I think. What practices will you continue going forward? How do you think, in other words, what will you take from this pandemic and say, you know what, that works better, we've got better international coverage as a result of these partnerships or collaborations? What will anything pertain?
Oh, absolutely. The voices that we have heard on Channel 4 News, you are only, if you were listening yesterday or the day before, you would have heard it. You would have heard the range of voices from various regions in India, people you may not have seen on Channel 4 News before. Well, you will see them again. And that's one very important thing for me. It's how to not just acknowledge, use, cultivate, but also embrace and make part of the Channel 4 News family, what the people and the reporters that we are seeing on air. That to me is hugely important. And the same goes for other reporters in Brazil, in Latin America, certainly in various countries in Africa.
Thank you, Liliane. I'm sure we'll come back to that issue. But for now, Vanessa, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to this. I'm going to start with the good stuff first, and it follows on, actually, my first point follows on from Liliane's quite well, because what has struck me is that right across broadcast media, we've been getting some very moving first-hand accounts from the front line in this global pandemic, from countries like India or Brazil, but also getting a lot of ordinary people's voices, the voices of and experiences of health workers, local experts, relatives, and a lot of local journalists. And I think that that has given not only a kind of a greater authenticity and diversity to some of the coverage, but it's also, I think, probably improved it in some ways. I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think it might have led to a deeper questioning of official versions. I'm thinking particularly of the statistics that the Indian government has been coming out with. And it's actually been a lot of local people who've said, hang on, you know, this doesn't add up. We've been counting and we've been data crunching. We're telling you this doesn't add up. And I think one of the criticisms that I would have of broadcast media, international broadcast media generally, is that very often it takes official government sources a little bit too readily at face value. So I think if that's something which carries on, that will be really great. I think the BBC World Service did a good job of direct engagement with diverse people, sometimes through phone-ins, sometimes through people just tweeting in from different parts of the world, commenting on news stories. And I think that gave things a much more sort of democratic and sort of horizontal feel. And it would be good if that continued as well, including kind of conversations with people who are experiencing COVID from different parts of the world and comparing their experiences. In terms of reliable scientific information, I think there's been a good amount of that coming through the broadcast media. Particularly, I think Radio 4's How to Vaccinate the World, a 21-part series, I think was good at, quite gently doing the job of correcting disinformation and misinformation. And I think in terms of looking at different approaches that different countries have taken to tackling the pandemic, there was a Panorama program recently which looked at South Korea and Kerala as examples of, how not to make a god-awful mess of it. Interestingly, Cuba and Vietnam tend to be missed out when talking about this, but still, maybe we'll come to that kind of thing later. On the not so good, obviously there's lots of things that have been underreported, and I think Liliane pointed to this. The thing that comes to mind is the human rights abuses of all kinds that are taking place under the cover of COVID. And I think that, there are many reasons that it's hard to report on this, but I think another reason is that the dominant narrative has been the medical emergency as opposed to all the things that are happening around it. But I think for me, the standout issue, which I'd really like to highlight, is apart from Channel 4, which actually did a very good program on this last week, there has been a gap on the issue of patents on vaccines and sharing of technology. There's been lots of news on supply problems, bottlenecks, export bans, hoarding, vaccine nationalism, lack of equity. Very little with regard to a possible solution and game changer, which is gaining international support. And I'm talking about the campaign for the People's Vaccine. There are two bits to this that could really unlock vaccine production across the world. One is the WHO's plan for a COVID-19 technological access pool, which would enable countries and companies to share technological know-how. And the aim of this would be to get manufacturers to increase the global supply at a lower price. But there has been pushback from this, from Big Pharma, and the UK government won't sign up to it. And the second part of it is a waiver on IP rights or patents on vaccines during the pandemic. And this is to enable vaccines to be made in any part of the world on all continents at scale. I think at this point, it's important to reiterate that most of the money that's gone into research and development on these vaccines has come from the public purse. It's public money. But the companies that are making them are in line to make absolutely massive profits. There's a lot of international support for the campaign. 2/3 of the WTO members are backing it. 400 or so civil society organizations, but it's being blocked in the WTO by the US, the EU, and the UK. Now, this is a story with a strong global element and a specifically UK interest. It's been around for weeks, if not maybe even months. I mean, even our, we do a bi-monthly magazine and we've covered it, right? As I said, it's been covered by C4 News, but for some reason, the BBC just doesn't seem interested. Why not? Well, I don't think it's because it's a bit nerdy. I think the lack of coverage points to a problem with the BBC's pro-business stance. And this is an issue that affects its coverage of many other things, of the climate emergency, of global economics, and so on. And it's apparent in the way that the pharmaceutical companies are presented as bold innovators, the heroes of the piece, whose vaccines are saving the world, not as companies that are clinging to patents in the thick of a global catastrophe in order to make eye-watering profits. I mean, even AstraZeneca's pledge to sell at cost is time limited and probably has already been broken by the sale to Africa at prices at a cost which is higher than the sales to the EU. Meanwhile, a lot is made of donations from the rich world, makers of and hoarders of vaccine, and this creates an image of charity when actually this is a matter of justice. So anyway, I think this also raises issues about colonial mindsets, but I think I've probably run out of time now, so maybe that's for later.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. You raised a whole heap of really important concerns there. I'm getting a slight bit of feedback. Make sure everybody's got their mics off. Thank you, Vanessa. So I'm going to pass on because we're slightly over time. So I'm going to go straight on now to Indi, please. You're next in line and you're very welcome. Over to you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I wanted to be more controversial, but so far I agree with everything you guys are saying. I'll bring it back to one point, and if the people watching only remember this one thing, I think it'll guide you pretty far. This is a quote from CLR James, which I got through Priyamvada Gopal. So it says, myth-making conceals another virulent poison for the myth-makers. It insists that they see themselves always as the givers and Africans as the takers, themselves as the teachers and Africans as the taught. So the reason I talk about that is you talk about the news and everything, and that's kind of what the BBC and all does. But the BBC and all of these state media companies are also part of the myth-making of Britain. And part of that myth is that you are sort of covering things from an international perspective when it is actually, in fact, like a British white perspective. And another part of that myth is that certain people are more qualified to tell the stories of the world, and that the world itself doesn't really have a voice, that you need to like have read certain books at, Eton or Cambridge or whatever and become enlightened. And then thus you're qualified to like fly into our countries and like tell us stuff and to also communicate that back to empire. And I think as Liliane was talking about, when the borders broke down for you, that's what we live like all the time. Like we live under passport apartheid. A Sri Lankan passport is a global kick me sign. It gets you into like 25% of the world and then like, every concentration camp in the world. And so what you felt when you couldn't move, we can't move all the time. Like it's not just vaccine apartheid. We live under pretty general apartheid. And that keeps our voices out of this conversation. And what CLR James is saying is that this is not like, it's not like, oh, pow for us. Like this is bad for you also. Like it's a poison. So COVID-19 infected you, but this poison of myth is kind of why the UK in particular got hit so hard. So let's take what he talked about when he talked about teachers versus taught. So there's this idea that the UK is always the teacher on public health issues, when in fact places like Mongolia or Vietnam or Taiwan, the immediate neighbors had experience with SARS, and learning from them would have saved tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. But people in the UK are not positioned to think of these people as having anything to teach, right? This is someplace you drop your NGOs into and like maybe explain back and you take pictures with some donations. But these are your teachers. Like these people have knowledge, right? Even if they don't have the same amount of like money, like money's not everything. Like they also have wisdom. And then CLR also talks about givers versus takers. So even with the vaccine thing, there's this idea that, oh, we're going to like give vaccines to people. And that's not what we're asking for. Like, there's this crazy idea that you are I'll use you in the French vous sense, that you are the industrialized world. But then, like, look at your clothes and look inside your medicine cabinets. Like, most of the factories are in our part of the world. Like, we're the industrialized world. Like, we have the industries. So people here aren't asking for like your leftover vaccines. We're asking for the ability to produce vaccines to help the world, which in places like India, despite their like fascist government, they have been doing. Like, I have an Indian vaccine in my arm. And then we get this crazy narrative from the West about vaccine diplomacy, right? As if there's ulterior motives, when you guys are practicing, I guess, like vaccine genocide on us by like not giving us anything. Again, I'm using you generally, not you ladies. You seem cool. And I don't know if I'm going over time, and I think to change the media environment, you guys have talked about it a bit, but we kind of need to change who's at the table. We have to change this idea that there's a certain type of person who has to communicate everything for you, and that person has to, be like essentially a rich white person. When in fact we can talk, which I think at Channel 4 you've discovered when you can have crews in those areas who are from those areas, and I think we have to get out of this idea that journalism is this caste, right? And it is something that people of all races and nations can do. And that's of benefits to all of us. And I also think in Britain, you guys have got to get used to the perspective that, like, I am not a minority. Like, I'm not asking for something like extra, right? There's billions of people that look like me. Like, if anything, white people are the minority. So you guys need to get used to like listening to other people as the teachers and as givers, because it could save your life. Like, it would have saved many of your lives during COVID-19. And so the final thing is that diversity is not for our benefit, right? Diversity it's not for like my benefit, it's for our benefit, it's for everyone's benefit. Having more people at the table simply just gets you more information, more perspectives. And in a century where we face untold threats, information can save our lives. And the final thing is, if I had any suggestion, I think you guys should cover the UK. I know you're talking about international coverage. I think you should get people from other countries like Rwanda or like South America to cover the UK, because y'all cannot like use words right on yourselves. Like, the word corruption is like super racialized, right? Like, the test and trace corruption is I think like 10 times Rwanda's GDP, and you reported like it was like oops. Whereas in any other country, it's like, no, that's corruption. And like, so yeah, I think maybe you can benefit. It's like having something on your face, right? Like, you can't see it unless someone points it out. So I think we got to just start thinking of media as like a sort of multiple way street, right? With lots of people at the table.
Thank you very much, Indi. I love that idea of the role reversal there. I think that's a really great one, challenging one, not one that people think of too often. I was also really struck by your phrase of rich nations posting their vaccination selfies in the article, the blog post that you wrote. And I wanted to ask you, what impact does that news of rich nations have on people in low and middle income countries? What presumably that doesn't go down well.
I can't speak for everyone, but I'm furious, and I will never forget this. Like, I will never forget this, because we know that like you guys talk all this stuff about China and like Russia being evil or whatever, but they actually like reached out and helped us and like treated us like human beings, and they treated us with respect. And we've gotten nothing but propaganda and like hoarding and blocking and like BS. And so these are the people who talk to us about human rights, but they don't give a damn about us as human beings. And I don't know about everybody else, but I won't forget.
Thank you, Indi. That's a really important point. Camilla, over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to speak about 5 key trends observed on how the media has covered COVID-19 here in the UK. And I'll make specific reference on how the pandemic was reported on in the UK as it was happening across Africa. And I should add that I'll be speaking from the perspective of being the UK director of a Nairobi-led NGO called Amref Health Africa, and very much from my personal experience of the news. And unlike Vanessa, I'm going to be starting with some of the more challenging trends that I've observed. And the first is that there's been a real tendency to talk about Africa as a country and to generalize about the African experience of COVID, which has really missed the huge diversity of experience of the pandemic across different countries in Africa, depending on the capacity of a country's health system, the strength of their economy, on how quickly governments responded. So at one end of the spectrum, for example, you have Tanzania with no lockdown and the then president reluctant to acknowledge the risks of COVID. And then at the other end, you have countries like Botswana, Ghana, Rwanda, and Senegal, who are very quick to close borders. And in the case of Senegal, even opted for widespread testing too. So people in Tanzania have experienced the pandemic very differently from people in Rwanda or Senegal. The second trend is there's been a lot of interest and a lot of focus on the numbers and an emphasis on COVID morbidity and mortality figures. And this focus on medical data and numbers has really missed the wider and deeper impact on the economic and social aspects of the pandemic and on society and people's lives more generally. It's ignored, for example, the massive impact on health systems and development, and indeed the losses in the development gain. So I was just hearing about TB and malaria, and the rates of these in Kenya and Ethiopia are starting to increase massively as resources have been diverted away from those diseases to treat COVID and address COVID. It also, that focus on figure underestimates the impact COVID is having on people living across Africa and justifies that funding just going to COVID rather than to the wider impact that COVID is happening, which is again really problematic. The message we're hearing as well from our health workers and community health workers is that actually people are much more concerned about whether the fact that their children haven't been at school, the fact that they need much needed TB treatment, and mental health issues than, for example, the COVID vaccine, which might shock some people. The other trend that I've seen is there's been a real lack of positive stories. I've been trying to find where are the positive stories on how countries across Africa mobilized and responded, putting lockdowns in place fast, organizing themselves under the Africa Union, working with the Africa CDC, WHO, AFRO, and the regional economic hubs on the continent. These actions contributed massively, we think, to decreasing the number of deaths among the populations in the countries that responded fast. And I think there's real lessons learned that could have been learned for us here in the UK and the rest of Europe. And this speaks again to Indi's point as well on the learning from countries in Asia who had experienced SARS before, that listening, that learning. And obviously West Africa had the Ebola crisis. So we would have really benefited here in the UK and across Europe from learning and listening from countries in Africa who'd experienced similar crises before, and as Indi says, in Asia as well. Fourthly, the UK public could do with much more consistency of coverage. So the tendency again for primetime news is to be very crisis driven. So leaving very little room for evolving story. So currently we're hearing about India. A few weeks ago, we're hearing about Brazil, about South Africa before that. So we're missing that follow through and follow up. And in my view, that consistency and telling the story as it develops, rather than treating it as a one-off, would show patterns and trends that continue over time and would, one, provide us with a much better understanding of the pandemic and the global nature of the pandemic. Two, it would give us a much better understanding of the underlying inequalities, e.g. in deferring access to healthcare, to clean water and sanitation, and how these inequalities are a threat to us all when it comes to COVID. No one, as we know, is safe until everyone is. And this is where the debate around the vaccine equity is so critical and realizing that we're all in it and we all should be lending our voice to ensure that we have people's vaccines easily accessible across is so important. And again, Vanessa and Indi have spoken to this. On the positive side, and ending on the positive side, again, Liliane mentioned it, Vanessa as well. COVID-19 has caused and perhaps accelerated some of those changes in reporting that we hope will continue, and that is with a much more increased appetite to work with local journalists, local photographers, with the inability, as Liliane described very articulately, that inability to travel. So at AMREF UK, for example, we've seen a marked increase in requests from UK-based journalists and media organisations wanting to speak directly with in-country staff or community health workers directly. And we saw a really nice example of that on Channel 4 News last week. So I think that and just to sort of finalise on that point, I think the other really positive trend has been being more forgiving of not having that sleek quality of footage and interviews, with interviews being done on Zoom and from mobile phones. And I think that again has enabled that voice to come out much more easily and much more frequently over the last few months, and really given a much more authentic view of what people's daily lives has been like, whether it's across Africa or elsewhere. And I conclude by saying that really having that more nuanced voice, that lived experience from around the world would really allow us for a much better understanding of this crisis, more solidarity between us as people, as nations, and above all, allow us to learn from the successes and to help us better prepare for the future and for future pandemics. Thanks.
Thank you, Camilla. I have a quick follow-up question to that. Is when you are placing people and news organisations together, so people from around the world with news organisations, is there ever an issue where people are expected to kind of jump to the agenda of those news organisations rather than set the agenda themselves? How does that negotiation take place?
Yeah, so it tends to be a conversation between both in terms of what whoever it is, the local journalists can provide, what access they have, and so on. What we've tried to do is really encourage particular standards and ethical guidelines on how to work with local journalists and local photographers, including asking them, what do you see as the priority, and ensuring consent is covered and so on. So, but it tends to be a conversation from our experience, at least within AMREF.
Thank you, Camilla. We'll come back to that in a bit with panel contributions, but Romilly, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Natalie. It's always hard, isn't it, to come at the end of such an interesting panel. You feel like all the good points have been made, but I just wanted to add a few reflections. I mean, one, I think that there has been more international coverage of this issue, which is obviously a good thing. But the challenge has been that there's still this sort of perception that we've got one pandemic going on in the UK and another pandemic happening in other countries. And this idea that actually none of us are safe until all of us are safe. We can't end this pandemic anywhere until we end it everywhere. That message is still not really that well understood. I think particularly at the moment, you look at the media coverage, there's some quite, really sort of positive messaging coming out about the UK, case numbers and death numbers being very low. And yet we've got this tragedy in India. And the fact that, actually what happens in India could impact us. There could be variants, there could be greater spread of different variants that don't work against, that our vaccines don't work again. We're still not seeing that. It's still seen as sort of UK versus abroad. So I think that's one thing that really needs to be improved in terms of the reporting on the pandemic. One thing that hasn't come up yet is Brexit. And I do think, particularly when some of these EU sort of UK tensions were at the fore, obviously the sort of historical baggage around Brexit was incredibly important. And I think from our perspective, this whole message of, this is a global pandemic, we need a global response, we need to work together, got a little bit drowned out by some of the sort of short-term kind of, EU bashing that went on in some parts of the media, obviously not the parts represented here, but I think that was a real issue. The other thing I wanted to say is that we've seen a real mismatch between what the polling tells us that the public really think and then some of the media coverage. So actually consistently, One and other NGOs have done polling which shows that the public do actually support vaccines being distributed around the world. This has come out, in the last 6 months consistently from polling. And yet if you listen to some of the media, I once did a very hostile interview where somebody said, "Oh, I can't believe you're actually asking for vaccines to be shared before every last person in the UK has the vaccine." That's actually not representative of what the British public think. And so I think that there is, there's a mismatch. And I think that sort of more global message, again, could be coming across. The fourth point I wanted to make, I think, builds well on Indi's point, that I don't think we've heard enough from Southern leaders on their perspective. And actually what we've heard a lot from our direct contacts is that real degree of anger. Indi, I think, and Vanessa both talked about this sort of, vaccine apartheid, or even your words, vaccine genocide, and actually that anger. And I don't think if you were just listening to the mainstream media in this country, you would understand that perspective. And I think that is really important, that people are not hearing quite how angry a lot of Southern leaders are with what's happening on vaccines. And I think it's one of those things that actually isn't that difficult. We're all now, joining media interviews and events and so on from Zoom, from our living rooms. If you're talking about leaders, most of them would have their internet connectivity to be able to do that. And I think that's something that could be, if there was one thing to put in your manifesto, actually making sure that we get those voices heard so that people in this country understand, really how we're being perceived in the rest of the world. I think it's really important. Just a couple of other quick reflections. Others have talked about this issue of success stories, and I had wanted to highlight, we do hear about New Zealand an awful lot. And I've got nothing against New Zealand, but as others have said, Vietnam, Mongolia, other countries that have done very well. And, there is this sort of bias on Australia, New Zealand, those sorts of countries. And I completely agree with what others have said, that I think that there is a real learning that we could have had. And the final point is, I think this is maybe a reflection on us as advocates as much as anything, sort of making the link between COVID and other big global challenges. So I know that in the early stage of the pandemic, some of the climate change communities were saying, look, this is just a drill for what's going to happen with climate change. Since then, I feel like that issue has fallen off the agenda, really. So, what have we learned from COVID and the way we're going to have to tackle other crises? We're really going to need to crack the crises in the coming years. We have a nature crisis, we have an injustice crisis, we have a climate crisis. What can we learn from how we've dealt with the COVID crisis? And I think that's something that really would be very, very helpful to gain greater media coverage and greater attention in the coming years. So I'll stop there with the interest of having a rich discussion.
Thank you very much, Romilly. I'm going to invite the panel now to respond to any contributions that have been made or comments. And maybe I will kick off just with a quick question that's come through in the chat, because I think it's a general one that will allow everyone to speak. But we are asked, is the problem that we don't cover the rest of the world enough in the media, or is it the way it's covered, or both? So is the problem we don't cover the rest of the world enough in the media, or is it the way it's covered, or both? I think many of you have touched on that, but maybe I'll come straight to Vanessa.
Both, I think, is my simple answer.
Anyone disagree with that? Go on, Romilly.
No, I don't disagree. I mean, I think also it's quite interesting to see the differential between the coverage of India and then Africa. And I completely take your point, Camilla, that we don't want to lump India and Africa together. But I think there is this difference between this kind of immediate crisis in India versus a kind of longer term crisis that we've seen in Africa. And also, I think the fact that, there's such close links between a lot of UK populations and India populations, it just feels like we're not actually identifying where the longer term challenges are. Completely agree with the point that we sort of rush from crises to crises. So I think I absolutely agree. It's both. I think it's that focus on the immediate, not the longer term. But I think it's, to go back to my original point, it's still presented as something over there that's happening to other people. It's not something that's happening to the world as a whole, which will therefore impact people in this country as well.
And kind of this, sorry, Indi, yeah?
Sorry, I just had one thing in that I've heard somewhere that policy is personnel. So I think sometimes we get caught up in like what we need to do to solve these problems, but like really, what are we going to do? It's really about like who is there. So with India, I think it kind of got covered because, you know, there's a lot of Indians in the UK. So like you could hear about it, like journalists knew and their friends and their Twitter feed, whatever told them about that. And with Africa, because migration is, I mean, they live under like they have a disease on a normal day, right? So like there just simply isn't the same connections. So a lot of this stuff, it's not about like the people in power suddenly like becoming enlightened. It's about other people coming into power and then diversifying the perspective. So I think it's not like what, but who.
That question of, sorry, Liliane. Your mic is muted, Liliane.
I'm going to say that it's a bit simplistic to say that we covered India because there are lots of Indians in this country, and we have not covered Africa to the same extent because of that. I would say we covered India because we have a tragedy in India, which was caused primarily, partially, by a complete mismanagement of a crisis, by utter corruption, by the fact that billions were spent on statues of Modi rather than ensuring that the health system was made to work. Because of who laid claim to beds, because of who died on the streets. We cover Africa, but we do not want to create a crisis in Africa. So when we, Channel 4 News, sent a team to Liberia, we very quickly realized that the story was not COVID in Liberia. The story was how COVID was impeding other forms of vaccination. And we also discovered that there is plenty to learn from Ebola, and that's what our programs were about. What could we learn from their experience of Ebola, and how is COVID making the health system not work because it is impeding other forms of vaccination? These are the reasons why we take the decisions that we take. So it's a bit flippant to say that we cover India because we've got Indian friends. I mean, you know, my best friend happens to be from India. I happen to be Arab. So, you know, but it's quite important, I think, for us to be nuanced in this discussion and not.
May I respond to that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So look, there was a similar disaster in Tanzania and so on. And I think with India, there's this tendency to rush in on like Modi being obviously like a fascist. And you also get a very different coverage of India than you did of Africa. You see like the bodies burning, you see people physically suffering. You see images that we didn't see out of Italy or New York, and you do get the disaster porn. And may I continue?
Yeah, you may.
May I? And I think that feeds into like your sort of thing, like we make these decisions, we show the world. And I think a lot of your audience likes that. Finally, like the brown people are like suffering and burning again. And you can like sit and make those decisions about what gets represented. And yeah, I think it's just, that's like, it's still that colonial attitude of like, the world is yours to like explore and discover and then present back to your empire.
Okay, so very quickly from one brown person to another. You're right about pictures. The pictures of burning pyres in India, I mean, you would know better than I will that this is the way that people bury their dead, as we in the Arab world bury them differently by very quickly bundling them in sheets and just doing it, right? Now, it is not, the image is important because the image can potentially lead to a racist discourse, but the textual voice that goes with the images is just as important. And this is the point that I'm making. I will not refrain from using the image if the textual voice that accompanies that image is one of clarification and clarity. That's what I would say. That's from one brown person to another. I'm muting now.
There's another question in the chat that kind of speaks to this issue, I think. And it asks, should there be more of a focus on what they're calling human interest stories around the world, or more focus on institutions. And I think this comes back to the concern around how we unpick geopolitical power in these stories. If we are kind of endlessly trying to find ways to get news audience attention through a focus on what we might think of as human interest. What should we do? Where should the balance be? How do we get to all of the really complex power concerns that many of you have referred to about big pharma, about state corruption? How do we unpick that amidst a desire to hold on to audiences through human interest concerns? Anyone?
I mean, I can't really speak from a broadcasting perspective, but I think from a print perspective, and it's probably the same, you go through the human interest to try and reach the deeper analysis of what the root causes are.
But isn't the problem then that going in through the human interest can lead you into the kind of colonial perspective of the human interest? I mean, that's the kind of, I worry that going there first rather than coming at it in reverse leads us there. Romilly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about some of the wider analysis that we've done on sort of from the kind of UK development community, that actually there's been sort of decades of portraying people in the South as often recipients and as sort of needy, and there's sort of a whole fundraising dialogue and so on. And I think that there is a real challenge, because I think the more that those people are portrayed as sort of they need our help and so on, that's not only bad from a kind of image perspective, but actually undermines the sort of long-term cause. We're finding from a kind of development community, we're finding that actually people get very disengaged from thinking about what's going on in developing countries or the southern countries, because they feel like nothing ever changes and it's all hopeless, and they feel very sort of pessimistic. So I think that it is right to engage through human interest. I was going to agree with Vanessa that I think you need the human interest to kind of make the links to institutions. But if it's always seen as very negative and problematic and focused on the problem, then that's actually bad in the long run. It's bad for sort of the way people see the world. So I think this issue of focusing more on solutions and what we can learn from what's happening around the world, and that kind of interconnectedness, it might not be so good from a kind of broadcast perspective, but from a sort of public interest perspective, I think that's absolutely critical. And I think we really should be hearing more of the solutions and the good positive stories.
I have a follow-on question actually to that, and which is there, if human interest stories is what could cut through and really bring that interconnectedness and really stress the global nature of where we are, whether it's on the pandemic or on climate change, do you as broadcasters see there? So Liliane, sorry, you're the only one who's there really representing. So sorry if it's targeted at you, but I'd be interested in hearing from you, Vanessa, as well. Do you think there's space to hear those voices? Can we have more of those lived experience, those voices? And do you think there's interest in the UK public? Were we to, because if not, why is it not happening? Why don't we get more of that in the daily news? I'm talking about, not specific features.
I do think it is unfair that there is not another broadcaster represented
on
this panel completely, and there should have been. Trying to answer your question, every single short film that we do in Channel 4 News about these issues is what we would call character-led. It starts with a person, it extends to a community, and it comes back to that person. So, and I'm going now beyond COVID to just kind of point at the films that we've recently, or the short VTs that we've recently done from Ethiopia and Tigray, and they were all about people. You can't talk about issues without talking about people. The person is your point of reference, and that's how we do it. So, and I think that, you know, I mean, some broadcasters do it better than others. I agree. Some broadcasters take the time to do it, and some broadcasters just do it in 2.5 minutes and I'm done. So yes, I mean, it is not perfect, but the way we do it in-house is to concentrate on the person and impact of a crisis or a story on that person. Otherwise, you will not identify with it, and otherwise the audience will not engage with it, and otherwise there is no understanding of what we're talking about.
Thank you, Liliane. I am conscious you're the only broadcaster, but I think comments from other people on the panel about what they feel about coverage or how they feel it can be done is just as relevant. There's another comment in the chat box here saying that Indi talked about myth making, and I was also struck by that. And the question asks, how do we change those myths? It says a lot seems really deep set in British media, and there's a kind of, you know, reinforcement of empire thinking rather than looking towards changing perspectives. And I think you've all mentioned a bit of that, about how the pandemic maybe has started to shift the ground on that. But how do we begin from the position of myth busting, of stopping those, you know, the endless reiteration of empire being, you know, normalized so often? Indi, I don't know whether you want to come in and...
Yeah, sure. Look, like I said, I think you change stories by changing storytellers. Like, do I personally have much hope of like British state media organizations like Channel 4 or the BBC like discovering this on their own? No. But I do have hope of like us in the world beginning to speak out and control, seize the means of media production ourselves and speak for ourselves. I think there's still this arrogance from even just the concept of like, how do we cover the international world better? Well, maybe, look, you guys have looked into the abyss long enough. I think it's time for the abyss to look into you.
Can I just say that I have to object to being called the state media. I mean, we are in no way a state media, nor is the BBC, and the fact that they get their funding from...
Yeah, so that's one of your myths, of course. Only Russia has state media.
No, it is not. If you look at the number of politicians who have refused to speak to Channel 4 News ever since the beginning of the pandemic, because of the criticism that Channel 4 News has openly and impartially addressed the various
policy. If I own a TV in London, who do I pay and why?
I don't understand the question.
There's like, you have like the TV, you have like the tax that goes into your state media that like pays you.
We have I think what this comes back to, in a sense, is all of that discussion that we referred to earlier about how we can learn from other places. So we've had our own oppression of journalists within the UK, right? You know, there was, if we think back to this time last year, you know, there was very tight control over those, the public sessions with the Prime Minister announcing daily in his press conference. You know, there were examples where journalists were frozen out for asking difficult questions or follow-up questions.
Still the case.
Still the case now. So, you know, there is, and so in terms of there being, you know, how we understand some of the oppression of journalism that's happened around the world, but also reflect on our own limitations. You know, there are real difficulties for journalists in getting access to some of this information. And I think there are legitimate issues being raised or concerns being raised about how organisations like the BBC can speak truth to power to the government when the government decides its licence fee, you know, how much money it gets. So there are, and those concerns are real and out there in the public very much, you know, is like, actually, is the BBC adequately holding our own government to account over these issues? And so
I just like to, sorry, go on.
No, carry on.
No, yeah, just like that, like even Liliane denying that she worked, like you're covered under a government department. Like how deep does the mythology go in the idea that your own journalists like wouldn't have bias. Like you're not like you can't see yourselves. You need foreign correspondents. Like you work for the state media.
This is getting a little bit too personal, perhaps.
Yeah, I think let's try and broaden it out to an understanding. I mean, I would like to hear.
I'm making a point, which is that Channel 4 is state media, which you can look up on Wikipedia. It's got nothing to do with you personally, and even you deflecting is like saying like, "Oh, don't talk about that. Like, sit down."
Public service broadcaster.
Like, keep the myth going, please.
No. Public service broadcaster is what we call it, as opposed to state media.
Okay. Oh, wow. So you have a difference. Yeah. So you don't call corruption, you call it sleaze, and you don't call state media, you call public service. So thank you for like changing words, but you use those same words on us. So do you see how it's working out?
I think it's an interesting point, because I think what we've got is we're trying to figure out as part of this whole campaign is what do we think of as public media, and how is it that, you know, maybe the media that we have are not the public media that we could be or want. And part of the exploration of this issue of international coverage was to dig deep into that. So maybe, you know, Indi, you've said we need other voices and we need other controls over it, and we need some bigger forms of public accountability maybe within that. So what would it mean to have public accountability over news coverage? And I want to come to Vanessa on this, because Vanessa, you have a very different model of media ownership at the New Internationalist, and you have a different form of reader accountability in that. How does that function in a way that's very different from other media?
Right. We are owned by our readers, or by, well, there are about 3,600 people who own us. And we have editorial control, but if we sort of divert from the principles of what we are set up for, they can hold us to account for it. There is a kind of a common council where they can influence the direction to some extent of what we cover. But of those owners, I mean, if you own 100 shares or you own 1 share, you have the same voice. You know, it's not you know, it's not like a normal situation. I was just thinking when you were talking that I think the way in which we try to work is to provide platforms for different voices, and also to go into sort of partnerships with media and media producers in the South. And I think that's how we managed to get a kind of a range of, certainly a diversity. And I think there could be probably more of that maybe there is more of that in broadcasting than I know about, but I just wonder if that's one way through it. I mean, sometimes we've handed over the editing of the issue to, say, we had an issue a few years ago which was edited by a combination actually of an Indian journalist and a British journalist. And the Indian journalist was writing about poverty in Britain from an Indian perspective, and then the British journalist was writing about poverty in India from their perspective, and then looking at, and you know, unsurprisingly, the Indian journalist came to the conclusion poverty, being poor in Britain, was really, really awful. So I mean, it kind of, I just wonder if there's, you know, more that could be done in that kind of way to kind of mix it all up a bit.
Romilly.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on that point, because I would like to see much more of that kind of, you know, what are the common challenges that we face in different countries, not a sort of north or south or, you know, developed or developing, but common challenges. One of the really interesting things I found when I worked at Overseas Development Institute, this is actually on education rather than COVID, but we went off to Ghana and we talked to women, so mothers in the local school in northern Ghana, and they said, you know, it's a real problem because the men never engage in the sort of, you know, PTA, the Parent Teacher Association around the school. And that really made me laugh, because I live in North London and we have a problem that the men never engage in the Parent-Teacher Association. So apologies to any men who are listening, but, you know, there's a sort of similar issue there. And there's, you know, how do you actually address these challenges, which are the same in Northern Ghana as in Northern London? And I think similarly, if you look at the whole issue of sort of vaccine hesitancy, here we've got this big issue about kind of, you know, ethnic minorities not taking up the vaccine, and there's a whole challenge around that. Now, this issue has been very well understood across the world in terms of differential access to health services by different ethnic groups and so on. And I feel like there's much more that we could learn. And again, not from that sort of top down, this teacher taught model, Indi. But I think that would be a way of also, to go back to what I was saying earlier, not seeing people in other countries as sort of other and having very different realities, but sort of understanding a little bit more about what the sort of common challenges, which COVID has really brought to the fore, I think, and we could build a bit more on.
I think that's really important points. And it comes into one of the other questions that is in the chat, which is, shouldn't we look at changing institutions rather than personnel? So it's not just about having you know, other voices come in, but it is also about changing the way those institutions may function. It says British media is owned by corporations, well, some of it is, or has strings to the license fee and controlled by UK government. Again, we can debate that. But can the people ever own this? It's saying, it says, shouldn't we all move, it says, to other media? So what it's saying there, I think that question is illustrating what is the role for public accountability in these platforms. How do people, if they want to change the content? I mean, Vanessa, you've shown that in a cooperative model it's easier, but maybe we need other means by which those voices can come in to other platforms too. And that's not easy. I don't think that's an easy you know, thing to do, actually. I think it's really very difficult, but it certainly seems like we're pointing towards that way. Another question here, which says, when Russia Today or Al Jazeera show poverty in the UK, especially through austerity, they get called state propagandists. But then what do we have? So I guess that's coming back then to Indi's point about saying, when other news outlets show poverty in the UK, then it's called state propaganda, but not when we show poverty of others. So, you know, these are questions that are all coming to a similar place. I want to go back to that sense of a positive news stories and where they can come in more, because I was really struck by, you know, the cases that we're always heard to hear about, which is New Zealand, but we've heard very little about Taiwan. And I did want to bring this up because I'm kind of baffled by this, that we have a densely populated island off the coast of a major continent, heavily reliant on international trade, a competitive multi-party democratic system, and it's had very, very few COVID-19 deaths. You know, 9 deaths as registered at the moment. The UK, we've had over 127,000. So why has this not been covered so much, do we think, in UK media? You two first, Vanessa.
I'm not sure why it hasn't been covered so much, but I think that there is one observation I'd like to make about that, is that there are not many women leaders in the world, but a lot of the countries that have done very well in tackling COVID early on, by moving fast, by being consultative, by involving health professionals and listening to them, have been led by women. And Taiwan is one example of that. The countries that have done really, really, really badly have tended to be led by populist men.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So President Tsai, I actually did some reading on that. So her vice president was the health minister during SARS. And after SARS, they passed legislation and they built physical infrastructure. There's this national command center, which she basically sort of delegated authority to during that time. And then they had a plan and they rolled it out. And they also didn't sit around like complaining about China. Like they're bigger enemies with China than anyone else. But they like learned from their enemy and they reacted quickly. Whereas like, I think many in the West were like comforted in the fact that like, oh, like we're enemies with China. We don't need to learn anything from them. And they missed the boat.
There's something else about Taiwan, which is that they set up border controls very, very quickly, track and trace measures that meant that people's phone data could be accessed publicly. And these were things that people absolutely accepted because of the health threat. So that's something that we need to talk about.
And was it also, I think that's right, Liliane, I think there was a big thing about the track and trace working really well because it was publicly owned. And I think that there was a lot of trust in that there was an agreement that this was a kind of public-private partnership that would work well and that no one would profit from. And I wonder whether there's also that trust building issue is really key that, you know, we could learn very well from, and the ways in which public media, you know, thinking of the internet as operating in a public interest way rather than as a, you know, global monopoly in that sense. So I think that there's also interesting things that we can begin to think about there. And that kind of takes me into the questions around issues to do with trust and public trust falling for all sorts of reasons, I think, around, and it's not just, of course, in terms of news and journalism, public trust is falling massively around our political leaders as well. But, you know, trust in news is really vital when you're in a global pandemic. It's literally an issue of life and death. So how do we feel that news organisations can rebuild public trust in relation to international news, if there's anything that we haven't covered already?
Look, I'll just add one thing. Is I think you're presuming like a public which wants like, you know, nice, positive human interest stories and which wants like trust building, like serious information. And if you look at the demand side of the media business, like, look, I like look at the Daily Mail, right? Like that's the biggest publication, and it's like supplying the demand what people want. And so there's this assumption that people like want good things, and on the demand side, that's kind of not true.
Yeah, although, Romilly.
Yeah, I mean, I made this point earlier, but actually, if you look at some of the polling, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, the point I made earlier on kind of the vaccine. I mean, I literally had I won't name the broadcaster, but I had a big fight on one radio interview when they said, you know, you really saying that we should be sending vaccines to other parts of the world rather than giving them to people in this country. And I was making the point, you know, actually, if you're talking about a healthy 18-year-old in this country needing a vaccine versus a health worker in Uganda that's got an underlying health condition, actually the public are very much on side with sending those vaccines. And I think often we make this assumption that this is what people want. They will want to read the Daily Mail. They want to get to the lowest common denominator. But I think often that's not actually borne out by the reality, and it becomes a bit sort of self-fulfilling. That I think, you know, media feel like they have to have these negative messages to sell papers, but I think you get a race to the bottom then rather than a race to the top.
Yeah.
Sorry, Camilla?
Yeah, I was just going to add on that, is that I still think there's something in really having a compelling story that comes from people with lived experience that are speaking directly to the public, and also talking about things, their daily lives, in a way that the UK public can relate to. And I'd use an example of a fundraising campaign that we did, which was connecting midwives in Uganda, in Kenya, with midwives in the UK, or working on FGMC and so on. And it took off in a way that we completely unexpected. The interest in the different stories and how they related to each other, and how similar the problems were, and not actually connected with people on an emotive level that actually propelled them, one, to give, but also to learn more about the work that we do. So I think one can take quite a cynical view, but I'm hopeful with the work that we've done around putting forward that more nuanced view with voices from people living the experience, from the countries that we work in is I think showing a trend, and I'm optimistic.
It's good to hear optimism. There's another question. Oh, Vanessa, you were going to come in?
I just wanted to make a point about social media. On social media, anger and fear are shared more and make much more money for Twitter and Facebook. And I'm afraid the same applies to the tabloid press. And I think probably the same would apply to broadcast media if and when we get something like Fox News. And I think that's a real problem. And I think what we're not talking about yet is the ownership of that media. I mean, I know this is about public service, but even so, that also affects the whole environment and affects the whole trust environment as well.
Yeah, so that we haven't spoken about the political economics in great detail. We have spoken about the New Internationalist different model as being functioning as a cooperative, but the economics and the business affects all of it. Even if it is a public service broadcaster, it's still impacted on by what is going on in the rest of the commercial world. So, I do think those concerns are very real, and clickbait is a real concern across all news production, I think, and this is presumably as true of kind of international news coverage as it is of anything else. And this ties into one other question that's come through in the chat, is that often news responds or needs to report on crises. And that part of that is that, crises are news is news, and you have to report on it. But that maybe mitigates against reporting on more deeper, broader, wider, longer conversations that might point towards solutions or have different ways of addressing some of these huge concerns that we're dealing with. That if we had a different business model of news, would that solve the problem? Yeah, stumped silence. I think it's, that's it. If we're going to get away from clickbait, then this actually means tackling a very big issue around the ways in which our social media platforms function and the economic model that they're operating with. And that's, of course, is a huge question, but it's not one that maybe we should avoid. Is there a possibility that we could actually have a public voice that's saying, maybe we don't want all of our data being extracted and collected for profit on these platforms, which is guiding certain stories to be viral because they drive advertising revenue?
That's a hard problem. I think you need new people. There's this quote from Max Planck, which says that new science only proceeds because old scientists die. I think you do need a new generation of people to solve those problems. It's not something we can sit on a panel and be like, yeah, this is the answer.
No, sure. I don't expect you to have the answers, but maybe just alerting ourselves to the problem is a first step in the right direction. Sorry, someone else was about to speak, Vanessa.
Yeah. I think a more pluralism in media ownership, I think, would help. I think more diversity in who are the media, and that that includes racial diversity particularly as well, which is a problem in the media in this country particularly. I think these things could help, and the model that you seem to be sort of edging towards, Natalie, sounds very interesting. So I think yes, it's definitely worth exploring all these things. There's got to be a better model than what we've got, because what we've got at the moment is so awful, really. So I think we've got to look for different ways of doing it.
If I may add something, I don't think you can look at media as sort of like an isolated thing. It exists within power structures. It exists within capitalist structures. So it sort of communicates that. So if you have things where billionaires are getting more billion-y, then then they take over media, and then suddenly you get these weird voices in, and they have weird incentives in their own way. So if you try and fix it, you might be fixing it at the wrong point. You're fixing it at the end of the river rather than at the beginning of it. And you have to look at what is the structure? What happened with Thatcher, where you start dismantling a state? So then maybe the state media also starts to fall apart. Like what happens when you start giving so much power to people with money, then maybe they get more voice. So the root of the problem may be there.
You can have a cap on media ownership, for example.
Yeah. I mean, look how intense people got about like their football teams getting taken over, right? If they could muster half that energy for like the media, then, you know, you'd be in a better place. Maybe you guys should get like, I don't know, Ronaldo or something to work with you.
That would be great. I mean, you know, I should point out here that the Media Reform Coalition has just written a recent report on increasing concentration of media ownership in the UK. And in particular, we can see the increase in newspapers. So that we now have 3 corporations that own 90% of newspaper circulation in the UK. And that is increasing concentration of ownership over time. And that's a major problem, I think. You know, if we're talking about anything to do with diversity of voices, then that has to be a big issue across the board. And that's a focus on newspapers, not on broadcasters. But what that does bring into play, I think, is that you know, the kind of public is being ever more squeezed out of that, and the commercial and the private is becoming ever more crucial. You know, these are not organisations that would even claim to be necessarily operating in the public interest. These are organisations that are really primary concern is to make profit. So you know, I think that is you know, ownership is a crucial issue that we do have to tackle across the board, and that does come back to how our you know, the public accountability of our public service broadcasters. They're regulated by an organisation called Ofcom, and how much of a voice the public can have in relation to that regulator as well. We are 5 minutes off closing, so I'm going to ask each of the panellists in turn to give a final contribution, and maybe to reflect back on that initial question was, you know, if there was one thing that you felt should be in a manifesto for a public's media from the perspective of international news coverage, what would it be? And I'm going to go in reverse order to how we began. So that means starting with you, Romilly.
I thought you might say that, Natalie. I mean, I want to go back to my initial remarks about this sort of making sure that we get sort of Southern perspectives. And I know it's a sort of obvious thing to say, but I do think, particularly with this greater connection, we've all learned how to use Zoom and all the rest of it, you know, making sure that there's a real commitment in a way that actually on sort of panels, there's a lot of commitment now around manels and male-only panels, which I'm pleased to see today is absolutely not. But, you know, actually having a commitment that, you know, there won't be an episode on COVID without at least one, you know, health minister from a African country or something along those lines. I think that would be absolutely critical to my mind.
Thank you, Romilly. Over to Camilla.
Yeah, I'll build on Romilly so we really create that manifesto. So for me, it would be about bringing that voice from the global south, but not necessarily looking for the minister or the expert. It would be bringing that voice from communities, from the health workers that are working daily on the issues that we're covering. So, and really bringing that lived experience in much more.
Thank you very much. Indi.
So I think if you're talking about improving international coverage, I would just say like have less coverage and more international, like allow people to tell their own stories.
Thank you very much, Indi. Vanessa. Oh, you're on mute, Vanessa.
I think I would suggest a bigger platform for dissent, really, for diverse and civil society voices, for local independent journalists, but also a readiness to go a few steps further and engage with ideas that may appear radical. I mean, I think we have a media, and particularly public service media, that sometimes seems to be operating within very narrow parameters. It's as though, the being the middle of the road is the same as being unbiased. And in being like that, it misses ways to deal with, some of the really thorny problems we've got, such as the pandemic and future pandemics, and the growth model, the economic growth model, which are, at the center of our climate catastrophe. And if we're missing ways of dealing with these problems, we're missing ways of saving lives. So it is a kind of life and death thing. So I'm almost asking for more analysis, actually. Start with a personal story, but let's go further and deeper, and be prepared to be, really quite radical.
Thank you, Vanessa. And finally, Liliane.
I'm going to agree with Indi, believe it or not. My ideal media would be a media that speaks with a multiplicity of voices and accents, a media that looks in multiple directions, a media that has multiple points of reference, a proper internationalist media that would never use we and us and our, and a media that will break no favor and no fear. So that's my media.
I think that's a great place to end. I want to say a huge thank you to all our panelists for a fascinating and illuminating discussion that wasn't frightened to tackle difficult issues, and I think will be really interesting for very many of our viewers as they watch it on catch up as well. And so enormous thank you to everyone. To everybody watching, please do add your own comments on what you think should be included in a People's Manifesto in the slide that will come at the end of this panel discussion. Please do visit the website BBC and Beyond, Reimagining a Public Media, and leave your comments there. And I want to end by saying a huge thank you to the International Broadcasting Trust for partnering with us on this event, and also a huge thank you to the tech team behind the scenes who have done a brilliant job. But finally, thank you to all of you. It's been a brilliant discussion, and I'm hugely grateful to you. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.